So now we're on to the slide of the gender ideology in sports, girls and women as invaders. Again, females in certain sports may threaten traditional ideas about gender, meaning that you can't be rough and physical and aggressive, and if you do that, if you're in a sport, then you're not really being a female. There's been great myths throughout history to prevent women from playing sports, which is really interesting. They have told women that you won't be able to have children if you play sports, and you won't be able to get married, just so that they wouldn't be involved. Encouragement varies by sport and whether the sport emphasizes grace and power. So figure skating, gymnastics, cheerleading, go for it. That's beautiful and graceful and really shows off feminine cues. So the encouragement to do those has really been higher compared to going out and going out for wrestling, or even playing like a sport like softball. Those aggressive sports that really, basketball, that really challenge our views on females. Being a tomboy is okay as long as traditional feminine cues are present. So what they're saying here is that you can be an aggressive female who likes to play sports, but we better see a ponytail, we better see a ribbon in your hair, nice fitted clothes, maybe some makeup on, so that we still know you're a girl. That we still know that, being graceful and beautiful is important to you. Go ahead to the next slide. So here's a slide here. Girls and women, did engage in physical activity, but again, it was all ladylike behavior. It was going to be about grace and how you act on the field, and it wasn't what we're seeing today. Go ahead to the next slide. Ladies, not invaders. So, women have wanted to play sports for a long time. My mom grew up in the 70s, and sports were really just emerging then, and she really wanted to do it, but her high school had very limited access, or provided limited opportunities. She played a little rugby, and that was about it. But as this slide goes on to talk, it refers to women as ladies, and really kind of make sure that we separate males from female. I mean, luckily here at Wartburg, we're not the lady knights, we're just the knights, which is really nice. At the bottom there, it says that the term lady does not come with these constraints, but lady teams continue to receive fewer resources than the men's teams. Go ahead to the next slide. So changes in gender ideology, there's some prerequisite for it to happen. Number one, gender is a fundamental organization of principle of social life. So, it's embedded so deep that, it's going to be hard to make some of these changes. Gender ideology influences how we think about and identify ourselves as individuals, form and evaluate relationships. How are you interacting with that person? A lot of it's based on the gender. And, I need you guys to think about that a little bit. How do you guys interact with each other? In what capacity? Just think about, for example, dorm life. Okay, at Wartburg, what's considered co-ed, what's considered acceptable, living with a, male, female living together, that doesn't happen, that's not allowed, those are kind of the restrictions and things, and, rules that have been put in place, and, how would that change? How would that look different? Present themselves to others. So how do you present yourself? Earlier I talked about making sure if you're a tomboy, that you still exude some feminine cues. And early on in my coaching career, I definitely wanted to make sure people knew I was still feminine. Make sure I had a nice long ponytail, maybe a cute headband in, cute coaching clothes, made sure I wore my wedding ring. I wanted people to know I was still a female in a coaching world because of all the stigma behind it. Development expectations for ourselves and others, and then organize and distribute awards around social worlds. Go to the next slide. So, progress, there has been progress. It'll feel a little male bashing right now, but this is the reality. This is where society is, and there's no hiding it, and we're not going to not talk about it. But there has been some movement in the positive direction for females. Number one would be legislation, Title IX, which we're going to get into, and I really want you guys to have a good understanding of Title IX. Global rights movement, which has actually been occurring over the last year. Lots of marches and things for women in equal pay and having a voice. global health and fitness movement, and then the increased coverage of women's sports, which has been wonderful. You know, a lot, specifically soccer, and has had a huge increase in coverage on a national scale, and getting access to those games. Now, again, it's U.S. women's soccer. Their professional league is rarely covered. It's on like Lifetime, some more of those private channels. But again, increased coverage. Go to the next slide. Fairness and equality issues revolve around sports participation patterns compared by gender. So how many males are playing compared to females, kind of stuff. Gender inequalities relate to participation opportunities. So when we're talking about inequalities, how many opportunities are women really getting to participate? Support for those athletes. Where is money going into? Or what teams are this money going into? Jobs in coaching and administration. It is we're going to talk about it a little bit, but it is unbelievable how very few females actually get into this position of coaching. And then once they get here, how often they get into those administration roles. They're still dominated by males. Strategies for achieving, equal opportunities for girls and women. So just sitting down and saying, like, how do we go about navigating this and making sure females and young women have opportunities the same as males? Go to the next slide. So Title IX, here we go. If you're going to take away anything from this presentation, I want you to take away what Title IX really is. If we were together in person, we would be discussing that there is the stigma that Title IX was developed for sports, and it was not. And I have a video that you're going to watch, the history on Title IX, so that will also help kind of affirm everything you're going to read in the book and what I'm going to talk about. So here's the law, okay? So, verbatim, but what I want you to take away from it is, no person based on sex. So it doesn't say no female, it says no person based on sex. So that would also be, males, can be excluded from participation, be denied benefits, or subject to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal assistance. So I have a question for you, and I want you to think about this. Should Wartburg have to follow Title IX? It's a private school. I want you to take a second to think about it. Now, be really honest with yourself with what you said. Should Wartburg follow Title IX? We're a private school. It says public funding, okay? That receives federal assistance. Well, federal loans is federal assistance. A lot of our students receive federal loans. So yes, we do have to follow Title IX here. Private organizations, you're talking about like private clubs and stuff that essentially receive no money from the government. They're not required to follow Title IX. Biggest thing with Title IX is that it was an educational bill that was started. It was not started because of sports. It was started for education. Go ahead to the next slide. There's a click there, for when it was signed by President Nixon in 1972. So with Title IX, there's 3 tests to make sure a school's in compliance, if you will, or, is really following the law. So the first one is, this proportionality test. So the amount of women on the teams is close to the enrollment. So you take how many women are enrolled at a college, and that percentage should be close to how many women are playing, so easier example, 42% of the students at Wartburg are female, okay? That's just off the top of my head. It's higher than that, but 42%. Well, then, the amount of girls that are playing sports, so if we have 500 athletes here, 42% of them or close to it should be athletes, okay? I hope that makes sense. The history of progress tests, so judged by actions in essentially progression over the past 3 years. So schools could be in line with Title IX because they're progressing and they're doing things to help females. Okay, so they are showing that over the last 3 years, look, we've added this sport, we've added this money, we've done these things to advance women athletics. The accommodation of interest tests, so programs and teams that the school provides really, meet the interest of the sex that's underrepresented. In most cases, it would be the females, but there could be males situations too. So, for example, like at Wartburg, we probably wouldn't have a real strong interest in like cross country skiing. Okay, we maybe don't have a lot of access to that kind of stuff. Or maybe like water polo would be difficult. But as long as, their programs are matching up with the interest. Key again, you just have to be following one of these. If you're doing one of these, then you're good to go. You're in line with Title IX. Go ahead to the next slide. So Title IX arguments. Women's sports don't pay for themselves. Okay, well, there's a lot of activities at colleges and high schools that don't pay for themselves. Okay, marching bands don't pay for themselves. Cheerleaders, debate teams, most choirs don't pay for themselves. I mean, not a lot. Wartburg has a wonderful choir, and they have Christmas with Wartburg and stuff. But a lot of choir and music programs don't pay for themselves. Student government doesn't always pay for themselves. So to use that argument that it's not fair women get this money because they don't pay for themselves is really, you'd be talking about a lot of programs then being cut or shouldn't receive fair opportunities. Football pays for everyone in athletics. This is one of the biggest myths that's out there. It is huge. And again, if we were meeting in person, we would get more into this discussion to kind of get your idea. No one would argue that they don't make large amounts of revenue. But we're talking like the big dog schools, like the really, really big dog schools, like the top 25, when we're watching the polls in the fall, like the big dog schools, they're bringing in a lot of money. But guess what? They're spending a lot of money. You know how much the University of Iowa's, head football coach makes, his assistants, how much scholarships they're getting out, how much it is just to equip them and make sure the stadium's running. I mean, it is an expensive thing to have a football team within your college. And again, we're talking about the big dogs, We're not talking about even the D2, D3. Those schools, those football programs aren't bringing in oodles of money. As this points out here, average loss is just under $10 million. So most D1 football programs lose money. Okay, lose it because it's so expensive to run. And I list them here: equipment costs, stadium upkeep, head coaches, salaries, and the roster size. If you want more information or if you disagree with the slide, I would love to have a conversation with you, and I'd be happy to share some more statistical information. Go ahead to the next slide. It continues on with, kind of similar, just reiterating that, there's huge myth that football actually supplies money for everybody. Go ahead to the next slide. So Title IX in the U.S. has really changed the scope of allowing women to be a part of educational activities. It really, really changed it, which was great. Demonstrated that law and law enforcement do not exist in a vacuum, and that we can kind of go on a broader sense. Demonstrated that when laws change the ideas and lifestyles of people with power, enforcement of those laws will be questioned. So you're going to learn in the video that not everybody just, when this Title IX came in 1972, that's not when sports started. I mean, it's been a real challenge to get people in line with this law. Go ahead to the next slide. So the war on coaching, there's an article here, and I want you to click on it. It was an article done in January of 2015, so it's just almost a year and a half old. And I'm not going to read through it, but when you have time, I think you really should look through it. It is a list of all the women coaches that have been fired over about the last 10 years and why they've been fired. I think the most interesting one is essentially the article was made because of the University of, let's see here, it's right towards the bottom here. Sorry, University of Minnesota Duluth had hockey coach. Short version, hockey coach, super successful, went to the NCAA tournament, was an Olympic player. She was getting paid quite a bit, and they cut her job. And they said, we can't afford to keep you on staff anymore. And she came back and said, that's fine, I'll take a pay cut. I want to stay here. And they said, no. The men's coach, way less successful, didn't even make the NCAA tournament, was making more than this woman coach, and he was still on staff. So, I mean, there is some situations here where women are getting released from their jobs for, really poor reasons and really lacking legitimacy behind their, letting them go. So when you have time, even stop the PowerPoint here, go ahead and look through this article, because it's really interesting to give you an idea of how difficult being a female, and a lot of them have gotten fired because of how aggressive they are, verbal attacks, things like that, and how men are kind of able to do some different things. Go ahead to the next slide. So in 2016, Cambridge University did a study. They looked at 600 million words from the press in relation to sports. Men are 3 times more likely to be mentioned in a sports context. Women are described by their marital status, age, and appearance. And ever since I've seen this study over the last year, when I'm watching women's sports, it's so interesting. They talk about husbands, they talk about their kids, they talk about how old they are and, or how young they are. And that type of conversation you don't hear a lot. You don't hear, as you're watching the NBA finals, them discuss about LeBron and his wife. They might mention it here and there, but they're talking about how he's playing, what he's doing, things like that. Top women athletes are compared to male counterparts all the time. So when you have a really good female athlete, they'll compare them to a male athlete and be like, well, how would she do against this individual, or she's similar to this male, and that's like the ultimate compliment, right? I'm a female athlete and I've just been described, compared to I'm the LeBron James of women's athletics, and it's just interesting that that's pretty normal for us. That's what we do. Women's sports are by gender, male sports are default. So, for example, it is Wartburg soccer. When you say Wartburg soccer, people are going to think of the men's team. When you say we have to say Wartburg women's soccer. Watch ESPN sometime, okay? When they scroll at the bottom, like the scores, if you've never watched ESPN, they scroll at the bottom, the scores, and NCAA stuff comes up. It'll say NCAA MB, okay? Or it will say NCAA B, so for basketball. Then it'll say NCAA WB, so we know it's women's basketball. So the default is always men's. It's not assumed to be women's. Go ahead to the next slide. So gender inequalities remain in the United States and worldwide, which isn't a surprise to any of us, considering the climate of our society and, the women's, marches and things. And a lot of the conversation now isn't so much with sports, but it's about pay equality, because women make significantly less than men still in the United States. Okay, so we're still quite behind compared to our male counterparts. Really the inequalities here that I want to point out are participation rates, the support given to female athletes, and then access to power position in women's sports, and and really being able to be, for other women to see other women in power positions. Go ahead to the next slide. So categories of support for athletes. So access to facilities, quality of the facilities, how many scholarships, program operating, recruiting budget, scheduling of games, travel per diem, number of coaches on the staff, salary for the staff, medical training. I mean, these are all areas where, how do they support the athletes? So now we're talking about facing football. Football really is its own identity. When you're talking about Title IX and stuff, they tend to pair up sports and they make them brother sister. So what I mean by that is, for example, at Wartburg, like our brother sport, if you will, would be men's soccer. So, our resources should fairly be similar to men's soccer. How many coaches we're allowed, things like that, what we have access to, it should look, pretty much the same. Football doesn't have a sister sport because think about it. What women's sport would you compare to football? It's huge. Most teams have somewhere between 100 and 150 guys. The type of equipment they need. It's a really unique sport. You can pair up other sports, but that one's a really difficult one to do. And again, this slide just kind of reiterates what I just said. More players involved. There is no women's football right now. And it's a huge obstacle because it kind of just gets set aside, but that's what our society values. Now, regardless of your opinion about football, that's what our society values. Go ahead to the next slide. The slide here, when football is the culture and structural centerpiece of school and community, gender inequalities are likely to exist. Next slide. This is just a breakdown of the percentage of female head coaches, and it only goes to 2012. I tried to find a new slide that was a little bit more recent, but I couldn't. It looks like they do these kind of studies in chunks, if you will. But, the percentages, the only sport that more women are coaching in 2012 would be soccer, and it's still at 32%. 32% of the head coaches are female. The rest are all male. Everybody else has dropped since the 70s. So think to yourself, okay, what? There was more female coaches in the 70s? What? Well, guess what? Males didn't want to coach females in the 70s. They wanted to coach males. And now they're figuring out, like, oh, women's sports can be exciting, or I like it, I enjoy it, they're, can have success. I want to be a part of that as well. So coaching and administration, reasons for underrepresentation. Why aren't there more women in these positions? Well, number one, women are not considered for half of all coaching jobs. So think about that. Well, what do you mean they're not considered for half of all coaching jobs? Well, let's talk about women's soccer, or soccer in general. When a soccer job gets posted, okay, for a women's team, even if you've coached men your whole life, you could apply for that job. You're a male and you'll be considered for it. But as a female, for me to go and apply for a men's job to coach a men's soccer team, what? Like, that would be unheard of. There are some women out there that coach men's teams, but men can be considered. A team within our region, that's all I'll say, got a new head coach, has very little experience with women. And everybody is so excited that he got this job. He's such a great coach. He's wonderful. And that's all I've heard about. But I asked, why were you interested in coaching women? I met with him and he's like, well, I was trying to get back in the college game and I just couldn't get my foot back in with the men's side. Unbelievable. I mean, that's the stigma. Can't get in the men's side, I'm going to go to the women. So women don't have that same kind of capacity. Like, I can't get into the women's game, I'm going to go apply for a men's job. I mean, that just doesn't happen. Women lack fully developed and effective networks to compete with men. The example I like to give to our class is I go to a coaching convention almost every year for soccer. There's around 8,000 to 10,000 soccer coaches. It's crazy. High school coaches, college coaches, club coaches, the whole thing. And there's usually, out of that 8,000 to 10,000, there's only about 500 of us female there. So, to network with these men, it's way more difficult to kind of infiltrate that. Search committees often have members who, use orthodox, like those, normal gender ideology roles to assess the best job applicant. Luckily, most places, not most places, but a place like Wartburg does a really good job of assessing the best candidate. But not every place does that. Many women lack the support system and professional development opportunities that men have. So a lot of you, when you were in your earlier discussion and personal reflection, talked about like hard work, you can get where you want to be. Sometimes women don't get access to this stuff. They don't get to the assistant jobs, or they don't get to, be the GAs. Those opportunities go to males. And then when you go to apply for a better job, well, this person has more experience. It only makes sense to hire him. Well, how am I supposed to get the experience in the first place? Go ahead to the next slide, which it continues on. Many women avoid careers in sports orientation because they're male dominant, male identified, male centered. Majority of my job, okay, besides working with my team, is I am constantly working with males. Male administrators, male counterparts. I just told you, when I go to conventions and professional development, I'm constantly around males and have to kind of fight that stigma of being an emotional female, excuse my language, being bitchy, all those things I have to fight because I'm in a male-centered, environment. Women experience more sexual harassment, which really, just essentially sets them up to fail. Go ahead to the next slide. So here's a video on mean tweets. It's pretty intense, but, pause me and watch this video on it. I think you'll find it very disturbing about how, people can, talk about women in this regard. Now that you've watched it, okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Barriers to gender inequality. So barriers, things that are blocking gender inequality. Budget cuts in private sports programs, resistance to government regulations, few models of women in power positions. So we as females don't have a lot of women in power positions. I'd like you guys to kind of think about your high school and middle school club experience. How many female coaches did you have, like in competitive situations? Obviously, I'm the head women's soccer coach here, so there would be females in this class. I would say, well, I have a female right now, but how many before this did you have? An emphasis on cosmetic fitness for women. We really put down women's sports. It's not as good, it's not as exciting, it's boring, all of that. Male-dominated, male-centered sports organizations. So recent actions, okay? So there's been some things over the last year that have occurred. So Princeton's men's swimming team canceled their season. They had emails about the women's swimming team. They were vulgar, offensive, racist. I mean, it was pretty bad. The Harvard men's soccer team, again, go ahead and you can copy this link and watch a video on it. It's, if you hadn't heard about the Harvard soccer team, it was pretty terrible. They essentially were making a list of the freshman girls on the Harvard freshman soccer, or on the soccer team, and really said some terrible things about them. And this was a tradition. Every year they made this list. Texas A&M football, this is unbelievable. Again, I watch and read these things because it's unreal. But they essentially did like a fundraiser where they invited all these women to come and learn about football. I mean, this was last year, okay? Last summer they did this. And they said, come and we want to teach about football. And they had all of these derogatory sexual comments that they thought were funny, but were completely offensive. And again, look at the article and read it. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all of these. Go ahead to the next slide. Events for men have outnumbered events for women in the Olympics for quite some time, as you can see here on this slide. Go to the next slide. Gender choices, for athletes that are women are, different. Cheerleading, dance teams, and men's professional sports really it's all based on how you look and things. And I don't know if any of you have heard or seen of the show The Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. It's on CMT. I know some of you are probably laughing at me now, but I've watched it. It's fascinating. It's unbelievable. And that's exactly what they do. I mean, they're very talented dancers and gymnasts, but they're judged on their body every single week. How do you look? There's girls on there that are size 2s and they're too big. I mean, it's unbelievable. Go ahead to the next slide. So gender inequality and sexuality. So sports have long been associated with male and heterosexual and expression of homophobia. So really, a space where homophobia is accepted, unfortunately. Challenges for the LGBT community continues to exist. LGBT worldwide are carefully to keep their identities hidden. It's even this day and age. It's a very scary process, and I sometimes it's difficult for me to really talk about it because I don't know what it feels like, but I have people in my life who have had to come out, and it's a scary thing, and it's not as easy. Even though this day and age there's so much more conversation about it, it's still difficult. Go on to the next slide. So here are some challenges for these individuals in sports. One, popular discourse erases gay men and lesbians from sports. It just does. Gay men and lesbians also have less freedom to really express themselves. I remember when the women's national team won the World Cup, and Abby Wambach ran out, famous soccer player, by the way, if you don't know, ran out to the crowd to kiss her wife. And it was a really big deal. And, they harped on it quite a bit. And, it's just not the same. Being out in sports careers, you have challenges. Women risk social acceptance, and obviously men risk social acceptance and physical safety. There's really just a don't ask, don't tell policy. Go ahead to the next slide. Martina was an outstanding tennis player, and she was one of the first female athletes to come out, and she really did a good job of kind of breaking that barrier, but she lost a lot of endorsements. I mean, this wasn't easy on her at all, but she's really been a pioneer in that regard. Go ahead to the next slide. Here's the definition of homophobia. So, the generalization of the fear or intolerance of anyone who isn't clearly classifiable as heterosexual, male, or female. So, homophobia is a powerful cultural factor that affects everyone, and pressures to conform into traditional gender roles and silence all of those who are not gender norm. Homophobia is just really not accepting others for, and we could get into a whole religious and philosophical discussion and things, but there's still hate rooted with homophobia. Go ahead to the next slide. Intersex and transgender sports or persons in sports. Here's what's interesting about this topic. This will be school year wise, okay, this coming up school year. This will be my 7th year teaching this class. And over the last 2 years is when this topic has really been more, mustered behind it, like a real buzz, if you will. And even I have had to really kind of like research and start to learn, like how are sports gonna, essentially approach this topic. There's a lot of individuals that, talking about transgender and how do they fit into this model of male and female? And I don't have the answer. And a lot of people don't. You have states discussing this. Do we go by their birth certificate, how they were born? Do we go by what they identify as? And it's really going to be a challenge. And making sure those individuals still feel accepted and still making sure those individuals have the opportunities that, they have a right to. Go ahead to the next slide. Strategies to achieve equality. Using law and to encourage grassroots activism, showing boys and men they can benefit from gender inequality. So instead of teaching our boys and men that, women playing sports, women using our field, like this is terrible, it's so boring, like teaching like this is a good thing. This only helps our sport. It's a good thing that the team is doing well. It's a good thing that, your sister's playing. It only encourages a great atmosphere of athletics. And changing the way we do sports. We're pretty robotic. This is how we do things and this is how we like them, but we're going to have to make some adjustments. Go to the next slide. So strategies to promote gender inequality. So the first one is confront discrimination and be an advocate for women coaches and administrators. And, that's what I hope I'm doing. I'm a women's coach and I am trying to make sure that I can be a decent role model and kind of show that a woman can be a head coach. Be an advocate for fair and open employment practices. Keep gender data, okay? Learn and educate others about the history of discrimination. Go to the next slide, which will just continue the list. Inform media of unfair practices. Package women's sports as revenue producers. Recruit women athletes into coaching. Again, you have this stigma that you can't do this job and be a mom. I've had people actually allude that to me, like, how are you a mom? Well, how are you a dad in coaching? It's just so different. I've had people ask me like, well, what if you have a baby during season? And then I say, well, what if the male coach has a baby during season? And sure, there are some differences in that regard, but to really act like we can't do this is quite disheartening, and I get it quite a lot. Use women hiring networks and create a supportive climate for women in your organization. Go to the next slide. So there needs to be some alternative definitions to masculinity, number one, okay? Number two, there needs to be some alternative definitions of femininity. And number three, we need to change how we do sports. We need to really encourage kind of like that lifetime participation and really change some of the verbiage that we use, intermix male and females and things like that. At the bottom it says, why aren't varsity sports in schools organized and around gender mixed sports that people will play in the future? So why don't we provide some opportunities for some other individuals to continue to be active the rest of their life? Go to the next slide. Girls and women as agents of change, okay? So sports participation can empower women, but it doesn't automatically happen. So just because I played soccer in college doesn't mean I'm going to help advance women's sports, okay? Most women, not most, I shouldn't generalize. some women, you know, are afraid to be like, oh, she's a feminist. Oh, she's all, you know, she's a male hater. So it's not always an encouraging environment to come out and really, you know, fight for women's athletics. Personal empowerment does not always lead to awareness for the need of gender transformation as a society, and elite athletes seldom are active agents of change when it comes to gender. But there are exceptions, like Julie Foudy, if you don't know who she is. She's an older women's soccer player. She played in the 90s and a little in the early 2000s. She's a huge advocate of you know, gender equality. Go ahead to the next slide. She's just one example. Elite female athletes, you know, seldom challenge the traditional ideology. So they have too much to lose if they're perceived as radical, feminist, or lesbian. And I've already told you about my experience. You know, want to make sure I'm feminine, want to make sure everyone knows I'm a girl. Also, you know, I remember early on in my teaching days, I would do this lecture and I would be concerned that the class would leave and be like, oh, she's a male hater. You know, she's a woman coach, so she's all upset about this. She's a feminist. You know, why is that a negative? You know, why do we view that as a negative? Corporate-driven empowerment discourse in sports often are tied to fitness and heterosexual attractiveness, and women athletes have little control of, you know, or a political voice. Go ahead to the next slide. So now for our guys in our class, here's how, you know, you can help essentially be agents of change or make changes. You know, create options for men to play sports that are not based solely on power and performance model, okay? Emphasize relationships and cooperation. So, you know, we've been talking about women this whole time, but male sports aren't perfect either. So what they're saying here is, let's get some sports out there where it's not just based on power and showing your manhood. Let's get some sports out there too that really talk about cooperation and working together. And provide opportunities for boys and men to learn how to maintain emotionally satisfying relationships. So really teaching them how to use their emotions and to connect with others. Go ahead to the next slide. So that's the end of this presentation. Obviously, you have a lot of different videos to watch. I have another video from a sports talk show that I would like you to watch. Please incorporate these different videos that I've given you, but and kind of give me your opinion, whether it's in your personal learning post or within your discussion questions. Thank you.